Okay, so now let's go into our second item for this week, which is now that we've started arrays, let's actually continue talking about them and introduce the concepts of looping. That's also called iteration. It's just a really good topic. So in this case, let's for this first one set up an 003 loops and arrays, which by the way, on one thing on GitHub you could do is create branches for these as well, which sometimes might be a little cleaner because then you don't have to see everything else. So maybe that's something, if you wanted to ask me about, we could do. I think if I was doing this from the beginning, that's probably the way I would have done it. Maybe when I'm teaching this from the beginning next fall, I'll do that. So, but if you want to know about that, let me know. So set up the 013 loops and arrays, normal files, and add the README file. Okay, so there's the setup. So this is where we ended up last time. I'm going to go ahead and clear this. Got my live server running, got my output from before. So here's the first question I want to have you like think about. What happens if we call with more instances of data, right? So when we pass it, when we call track mpg and cost, we only do it twice here, but what happens? And let's just do this. So I'm going to copy it a couple times, and now let's make up some data, right? So let's make up some, let's say 100 miles. Right? I used 7 gallons, right? That cost was 4. So make up data here. That's kind of my point. I'm going to say 600 miles. No, it doesn't have to be, kind of keep it in the range of what I don't know normal is, right? So let's say 600, I use, let's say 24. I got a really high gas price. Okay, so go through and do this, okay? So in your own, you can do this while we're doing it. Let's say I drove only a short trip, let's say 50 miles. I used 2 gallons and I paid $3. And then I'll leave this one as it is. Okay, so now what does this do, right? So now that we have more data that we're tracking, right? What does it do? So let's go ahead and go into here. So we know, boom, we get more output, which by the way, trip cost. Oh, this is where we could also use the round, correct? But notice that our miles per gallon is still 25.5, which is what it was last time. And that's because of the way we've written the calculate average is in this sense, we might think of this as hard coding these concepts here, or not concepts, these values. We're only looking at, right, the first one because of the way we've, like, let's just remind ourselves if it's been a minute since you've done that last assignment. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to clear this, right, the my array. Here's the values in here. Okay, so we know that the first one is mpg, the second one is cost, and so on and so forth. So this is the array that we've set up. Now we have more entries, and because we're only looking at to calculate average mpg, the 0 and the 2, we're not taking all this into account, which is a perfect reason why we want to learn how to loop over things. Okay, so one of the first things you want to kind of learn about arrays too are these methods for arrays. And I introduced this concept last time, but one of the most popular, and it's a very simple one, is if I did my array dot length, it would tell me that length is 12. Now, because it's 0 indexed, what do we know about the number of entries in there, right? Is it 12 if it starts at 0? No, it's 11 because we use 0 indexed, okay? So how do we write code that's much more flexible here, okay? So there's a couple things. I'm going to start by commenting out these 2 lines here. I'm going to come up to the array, and instead of which the name my array kind of doesn't make any sense because it doesn't really say anything, but it was the way we started, so it's okay. How about we say my mpg, right? That's one array. And then let's create another array called my trip cost equals. Now we have 2 arrays. What would we have to change here To you, what would change in this line now that we have two arrays? We want to have one array keep track of the cost, one array keep track of the miles per gallon. Okay. So we would change this, okay, to have one, meaning my, we need two different lines because we have two different, and you might wonder why. Now we're going to end up seeing and still dot push, okay, and in this case trip cost. Okay, so we're, if you remember from last time, we're pushing these values in, okay, and now by doing this, what does it change? Let's just go look real quick. Well, let's run it. Cool. Let's see if we broke anything. It's always good to know, did you break anything in doing this? No, we didn't really break anything. We could fix this real quick. Do you remember how to do that? How we fixed the trip cost, just like we did on the other one, math.round. There's also other methods on math we could use here, but to start with, this is a fine one. Okay. Okay. Nothing really here, but now let's go look at my mpg.length, right? There's 6 of them, which would make sense because now we're just, and again, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 calls, so that makes sense. And in this case, we know how many calls, how many times we've called and passed data in, but imagine you're doing a website. Would you know that? The answer is absolutely not. So we can use that knowledge of the length of that array to do something a bit more dynamic. Okay. All right, so how do we do that? Well, we have to learn about a structure called a for loop. That's kind of when you're starting with loops and iteration. Kind of the basic one is this for loop concept. Okay, now there's other loops out there. I personally like the for each. It's one of my favorite. You'll learn about that one kind of maybe in the next step. But and this look is going to look different than any code we've written before. We're going to say for, we're going to set up a variable, we're going to have a condition, and then we're going to say, okay, now once, and actually what I like about this is I like this initialization, condition, and afterthought. So it sets up a value, it checks for a condition, and then after it runs, it gives us what do you do after that? And I've never heard it called afterthought, but it's interesting too. If you've taken other languages, this is very similar to Java as well in C. This for loop is pretty common. And again, you'll learn, this is the basic one, and then you'll learn about other ones later because I just think they've made the looping code easier. But we always generally start with the for loop. So let's go ahead and write it. Okay. So for, not do, for, and then we say let I. And I is a very common one. I know in that first code example it said steps, but this is the one you see more often. You set up a variable. Okay, you say I equal, you set that value in. So when the loop first runs, it sets the value and then it tests for a condition. Let's say less than or equal to 10. You'll see why in a minute. And then let's say this is the after. So once you run, okay, what do you do with the I value is you increment it, and this just adds one to it. This is a not a prefix but a postfix operator, but it basically is just adding. So the first time it goes through, it's 0. Matter of fact, let's just look at that. Okay, so now we do curly braces, right? Curly brackets, and now we could do console.log, totally right. And then we could just console log I. Let's come back over here, go down here, and then we can see the first time, and again, use our tools, right? So let's go over here, and we go, oh, get out of here. So we're going to set the first time through, it's going to check the condition, and you can see what's happening here by every time you step. So it's stepping and it's saying, okay, what is I 0 the first time it runs through? It's console logging out 0. It's now, and you can see it's coming back to here because it's doing that incrementer or that afterthought. It's checking the condition, right? All right, cool. We still want, because we check the condition to see if we need to stop looping. And in this case, and by the way, if you're ever not sure of what this, because this is going to resolve to a Boolean. So if I said, in this case, I right now is equal to 1. So I let's just do 1. We could do it either way. Less than 10, right? It's true. So we're going to keep going. When I is not, right, does not is resolves to false, then we're going to stop. So watch that loop run. Okay, watch it run. Get used to that concept. Cool. Right. So hopefully that, and play around with this loop. And I'll have you do that formally in a minute, but the more you play around with this code, just the better it gets because you'll get some hands-on experience with it. Okay, so now that we've, oh, I should just use this. Why don't I use that? All right, now that we've done that, right? So now how can we use this loop, right, to calculate average? Because remember, what do we need to do to calculate average? We need to what? We need to calculate average, we need to determine total of occurrences and divide by the number. It's probably not, it's probably not the mathematical way to say it, but it's true. That's what you're by the number of occurrences. Okay. All right, so how do we do that here, given now what we know? Well, the first thing we'd want to do is grab into, because we have two arrays here, but let's just start with miles per gallon. I should have said, actually, let's do this. It's average miles per gallon, right? Average miles per gallon. Okay, just so we can kind of say this is the one that is going to calculate our miles per gallon. So how do we do this? Well, there's a couple ways we could do this, but probably the most easy is to think about the array. So my MPG, what do we know about that, right? My MPG. If I wanted to look at the first entry, then I would do that. Well, and as I'm looping over, then how do I reference it? I can reference that index or use that reference to the I as the index to say pull out that first value. How could that help me? How could I then total up each of those as I'm iterating over it, right? The first thought might be that we set up a variable, right? So total MPG equal maybe 0 to start, okay? And where this might make sense, what's going to happen is because this is going to run each time, all right? Let's just see this. Let's say if I said total MPG is going to be equal to whatever that total was before. And this is a fairly common expression, although we can even make it smaller later, right? Plus whatever the value of my array looking at that I, whatever that is. Okay, so this would, and let's just see it run. Okay, let's go ahead and let that run through. We have our breakpoint here. Now, let's see, we're here. There we go. Now we're stopped on that break. Why is that breakpoint not hitting? Let me change it. Oh, does it need to be inside? Shouldn't need to be inside. Hold on, let me figure that one out. Now that was funny. Took me a moment to realize because I had made a syntax error when I had called it. So therefore, it wasn't actually calling that code. It was erroring out, right? So remember to always check, right? In this case, right? If I refresh it, I was getting a heart. And remember, these type of errors, when they're red like this, they are actually stopping the execution of your program. Okay, so let's call this one average, where I should have been, you got to be consistent, Rio. Uh, okay, so now that I have that set up in there, now my breakpoint will activate. Okay, so I'm going through, my I set to 0. The condition is true, right? So now I run through the code. And now I say, okay, first time through it's 0. I'm going to take whatever that MPG is. Now, by the way, this is 0, not because of the loop, but because I set it that way. Okay, and now I'm going to take whatever that value is, and I'm going to add to it that first entry in the array. So in this case, what would that be? we could actually go down here. We could look at that. We can actually, we could do this. We could say total MPG. Let's just drop into it. Maybe I need to drop into the, okay. So I actually had to be within the loop itself. So what happens now the next time, because now what's I? I is equal to 2. I've actually run through it a couple of times. So what happens is because we're setting this value inside the loop, every time it loops, we are initializing that value. And so what we want to do is move this outside of the loop, move it here. Okay. So now, will that fix it, right? And not only that, once we get out of the loop, because this is a block scope, so this is gonna, if we set a variable here, it would only be accessible to us inside of here. We want it accessible to us, like in the scope concept, outside. Okay. So let's go ahead and now run through this code and see what it does. Now that we have, let's get a fresh version of it. There we go. We'll just refresh it. Hit X, refresh it. There we go. So do we have, yeah, so now we have the latest version. We've set it outside. Okay, so the first time we run through, and notice how up here you can see what it's doing for each of those values. Good. It's taking that value, adding it. Cool. So what number are we on right now? What's I is 4, right? So we'll just let it keep going. We know that there's, so what happens is when it completes the loop, right, completes counting, when this is false, right now it's 7. Awesome. Okay, now we're 9. Okay, so now we're going to drop out. Boom, we're out of the loop. And now, oh, yeah, so what happens is because we're here, right, we can't see that number anymore, right? Again, because now we need to actually do the calculation here. So what would we say? We'd say, okay, so now how do we know, right? Oh, actually, I missed something. This is good, right? I said that I was less than or equal to 10. Well, actually, in reality, what was the my MPG was 6. So what was happening was these not as in numbers were referencing, right, items in the array that weren't there. So a piece of this that I forgot to go over was actually setting the condition to look at the length of the array. And I showed you length before. So here's what you can do. You can say my mpg.length. So what this does is it controls the number of times you loop over based on the length of that array. Cool. Yeah, I did forget that. Okay. So now, boom, 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 we're going to run through this again. Okay. But let's actually break here. Let's do this. Let's do a console log m total mpg, right? In this case, after the loop. So we don't have to go through every time the loop, because now hopefully, and again, play with this. So let's break here, refresh. And now we've gone all the way through. You didn't see it because you didn't step through that code. We know at this point, go ahead and run it, right, that it's 142. So the total of adding up all of these, and we could check it by running it, but it seems about right. Okay, so now how do we then get the average, right? So we could do this. We could say let average MPG equal to total MPG divided by what? The number of occurrences. Well, what are the number of occurrences, right? So would it be my MPG length? Would that be it? What do you think? Because what is the length? Is 6, right? Remember, this is giving us how long it is. This is like, but if we were to reference at the 0 index, it would have been 5. But because we're asking for the length of it, this does allow us to get the average. Cool. So now what do we do with that, right? So we could either return it, right? Or we could just call update DOM, and we could say, okay, average MPG is, and inject into that template string that average MPG. Let's see that run. Sure that runs. Cool. Look at that. Okay. Does that look about right? Yeah. Yep. Yep. Sure looks about right. And now, okay. And actually I think I'll end this video here, not this assignment, but let's end this video here. But give these concepts some thought. Play around with this a little more. I'll have you write some code in a minute.